two uniformed officers exchanged derisive laughs as they roughly detained a black man, without any clear justification, until later in the courtroom they discovered that he was, in fact, the very judge slated to determine their fates. The stretch of road lay nearly deserted, its darkness punctured only by a scattering of distant headlights that sliced through the night like feeble blades. Nathan was making his way home after an exhausting day, his crisp suit jacket resting quietly on the passenger seat. He'd taken this route 100 times before, so tonight should have unfolded like any other. Yet, the sudden flare of red and blue reflected in his rearview mirror warned him that fate had a different script in store. He exhaled slowly as he guided his car to the roadside, keeping his hands in full view on the wheel while he waited, knowing the routine all too well. Soon, the crunch of gravel under approaching footsteps announced their arrival, and a stark beam of a flashlight caught through the window, momentarily blinding him. "License and registration," barked the lead officer, while his partner, his hand idly resting on his holster, hovered just behind. Nathan's fingers trembled as he reached for his wallet. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" he inquired softly, but the first officer brushed his question aside, flicking his flashlight around the interior. "You live around here, don't you?" he sneered. Nathan's jaw tightened, yet his tone stayed even. "Yes, sir, just on my way home from work." The officer scoffed. "Where do you work?" "I'm a judge," Nathan replied. For a suspended moment, his words hung in the charged air before the second officer's smirk deepened. "A judge, huh?" As he stepped in closer. "Show me some ID then." Nathan produced his driver's license and work credentials. The first officer snatched them without much regard, only to toss them back with a curt order, "Step out of the car." Hesitation flickered in Nathan's eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" he murmured as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his hands raised and visible, well aware that any argument would be futile. The first officer stalked behind him. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Before Nathan could process the rapid unfolding of events, cold metal snapped around his wrists. "What's the charge?" he asked calmly, his voice steady despite the injustice. "Resisting arrest," the officer replied flatly. Nathan exhaled slowly. He wasn't resisting, he hadn't done anything wrong, but he could feel the crushing gravity of the moment settling over him. The second officer snatched Nathan's wallet from the car's roof and rifled through it, shaking his head. "This guy's full of it, judge my ass," he muttered. Nathan remained silent. He knew all too well how the system operated and recognized that these officers had no inkling whom they had just cuffed. They were about to learn a lesson. Nathan felt the cold bite of the handcuffs lock around his wrist, their weight far greater than it ought to be. His fingers flexed automatically, testing the rigid restraint, a feeling not unfamiliar from courtroom proceedings when he had once fastened cuffs onto those whose fates he'd determined. But tonight, the metal was his burden. With a harsh jerk, the first officer tightened the cuffs until the metal bit into his skin. Nathan inhaled deeply, adrenaline hummed beneath his skin, though he made no outward show of it. The second officer sidled closer, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "You think you're special?" he hissed, venom lacing his words. "You really believe that your little judge act is going to save you?" Nathan met his gaze without flinching. "I told you the truth," came the quiet retort as the first officer chuckled dismissively. "Yeah, well, here's another truth. Out here, we call the shots." A rough hand gripped Nathan's shoulder, shoving him forward. The gravel crunched underfoot as they hurried him toward the squad car. Every step felt surreal, as though he were an onlooker in someone else's nightmare, a man who had once believed in the lost promise of justice, only now to be swallowed by its corruption. Face down, the first officer ordered as they reached the car. Nathan hesitated for a heartbeat. He'd seen how a single misstep, a misunderstood gesture, could escalate matters from bad to catastrophic in an instant. Slowly, he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool metal of the car as they rifled through his pockets, wallet, and phone. "What's this?" the second officer barked, yanking out Nathan's ID. Amid the shuffling of fingers through a plastic sleeve, the man scoffed, Judge Nathaniel Carter, reading it aloud in a tone dripping with sarcasm. "Would you look at that?" The first officer peered over his shoulder, snatching the ID away. "I'll be damned, he really is a judge." For a moment, silence fell between them. Nathan could almost hear the gears in their minds turning, trying to decipher how to handle this sudden twist, but it wasn't long before the first officer shoved the ID back into Nathan's wallet as if it were meaningless. "Doesn't change a damn thing," he muttered. "Take him in." Nathan lifted his head slightly, and before he could ask, the officer snapped his fingers at his partner, who had already begun scribbling notes. Obstruction. Resisting. Suspicious activity. We'll figure it out. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. He'd seen this performance before, thin charges engineered to justify an arrest, excuses that would crumble under the light of a courtroom. But in that moment, nothing mattered except that they had already decided he was guilty. The squad car door swung open, and the first officer shoved Nathan inside. The plastic seat was hard and unyielding, while the air reeked of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. He sank back into the seat, his eyes fixed on the barred partition separating him from the front. Through the windshield, he saw the second officer still smirking as he leaned against the hood, chatting into his radio. They thought they'd won. They believed they'd added another mark to their tally. Nathan said nothing, his pulse unchanging, for they had no inkling of what was coming next. At the station, the chill was palpable. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bathing everything in a sickly, pale glow. Seated on a hard bench in a holding cell, Nathan rested his hands loosely on his knees, the lingering imprint of the cuffs a dull, constant reminder of the night's absurdity. He watched impassively as an officer processed his paperwork at the desk, pausing intermittently to glance at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement to sheer indifference. No one saw him as a man, just another black face trapped in a system, another body destined to disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. The irony was not lost on him. He'd spent years listening to defendants recount abuse at the hands of law enforcement, tales so outrageous they barely seemed real. Yet, now that he sat within those very cracks of the system, he knew the truth firsthand. "Carter," a voice called, his name slicing through his reverie. Outside the cell, a sergeant with a clipboard regarded him coolly before saying, "You're free to go." Nathan didn't react immediately. "Charges," the sergeant's words followed a sharp exhalation. Of course, they had nothing substantial to hold him on. They hadn't needed a real reason to arrest him, only a convenient excuse. As the cell door slid open, Nathan rose, his back straight and his face composed, though inside, something quietly burned. He wasn't angry, he had long since transcended anger. Instead, he felt a slow, simmering understanding of just how far some would go to remind men like him of their so-called place. At the desk, his phone and wallet were nonchalantly tossed back without explanation. Carefully, he slid his ID back into its sleeve. The officer at the desk leaned in, murmuring, "You got lucky tonight." Nathan met his gaze, a small, unreadable smile tugging at his lips. "You have no idea," he replied silently. Stepping out into the cool night air, he inhaled deeply. Outside, nothing had changed, the streetlights still flickered, and cars continued their ceaseless procession. Life marched on, but for Nathan, everything was different now. This was no mere bad night, it was a harbinger that would shadow him into the courtroom, not as a scar, but as an indelible reminder that the next time he encountered these officers, the balance of power would shift dramatically. 2 weeks later, the courtroom teemed with people, officers in pristine uniforms, legal clerks, and a handful of reporters, all gathered for a disciplinary hearing that had unexpectedly captured public attention. Sergeant Daniel Briggs and Officer Kyle Mercer sat stiffly at the defense table, their uniforms immaculately pressed and polished, yet their faces betrayed no confidence. This was no routine proceeding. The charges, racial profiling, misconduct, false arrest, had started as minor allegations, but, as complaints mounted, the department had been forced to act. They had navigated disciplinary boards and internal investigations before, carefully keeping their statements curt, their emotions masked, and letting their union representatives handle the legal intricacies. Then, the door behind the bench creaked open. Nathan entered, his black robe billowing behind him as he advanced toward the judge's seat with deliberate, measured steps, his expression inscrutable. The low murmur of hushed conversation that had filled the courtroom moments ago evaporated into an absolute silence. The officers stiffened, their attorney exchanged puzzled glances with them. Sergeant Briggs's mouth went dry, and Mercer's face drained of color as it took several heartbeats for them to comprehend the surreal scene unfolding before them. The man they had roughly shoved against a car, the man they had ridiculed, the man they had locked away without cause, was Judge Nathaniel Carter. Nathan took his seat at the bench and adjusted the microphone. His gaze swept the room, finally resting on the two officers, no smirk, no hint of satisfaction, no words from him, not yet. The tension was nearly suffocating. Mercer shifted in his seat, his hands clenching the table, while Briggs's jaw tightened so much it seemed painful. Neither could move as Nathan tapped his gavel against the desk. His voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the silence. This hearing will now come to order. He let the quiet stretch, watching the dawning realization in their eyes. They had arrested the very man who now wielded the power to determine their fate. Nathan allowed the silence to linger just a beat longer, enough for the gravity of the moment to settle over the courtroom, a room not merely quiet, but electrically charged. Every person present felt the bitter irony encircling them. Briggs cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, while Mercer's eyes remained fixed on the table, his hands clasped as if he could vanish altogether. Finally, Nathan spoke, his voice measured and firm. "Officers Briggs and Mercer, you are here today in response to multiple complaints of racial profiling, misconduct, and unlawful arrest. You have both denied these allegations, insisting that your stops and arrests were justified and based on reasonable suspicion." His fingers tapped the desk in a slow, deliberate rhythm as he continued, "But let me remind you, reasonable suspicion is not some hunch, not a mere guess, and certainly not a license to detain innocent people simply because they make you uncomfortable." Mercer flinched at the words, Briggs's fists clenched in silent protest, yet neither spoke. Nathan leaned in slightly, his eyes locked on them. "Tell me, officers, was I resisting when I stood outside my car that night?" Briggs offered no reply. Mercer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Was I obstructing justice when I handed you my identification and complied with your orders?" Silence stretched between them. Nathan nodded as though their muteness answered his questions. He then turned to the department's representative, who sat rigidly at a side table. "Officer Mercer and Sergeant Briggs have a well-documented history of questionable stops, haven't they?" The rep hesitated before nodding. "There have been previous complaints, and yet, no action was taken." Another silence fell. Nathan exhaled slowly, straightened his posture, and declared, "Here's what will happen." At last, Briggs looked up, his eyes burning with desperation, and Mercer appeared as if he were holding his breath. "You will be suspended immediately pending a comprehensive investigation into every prior stop, every case, every report, every interaction over the past 5 years will be scrutinized. If a pattern emerges, and I have every reason to believe it will, then termination will be only the beginning of your troubles." Briggs began to protest, but Nathan raised a hand. "And just so there's no misunderstanding," he continued evenly, "if either of you still thinks this is personal, know this, I will not render the final judgment alone. A judicial panel will review the evidence." Mercer exhaled, shoulders slumping as he realized there would be no favors, no easy exits. This was real. Nathan tapped his gavel lightly once more. "This hearing is concluded." Briggs fell silent in his seat, his face flushed with frustration, with nothing left to argue or fight. Nathan gathered his papers, and as he turned to leave, he paused briefly, glancing back at them one last time. "I told you the truth that night," he said simply. "You just didn't want to believe it." Then, he strode out, leaving them alone to face the full measure of their actions, and, for the first time, they began to grasp what true accountability felt like. Nathan stepped from the courtroom into a quiet hallway, his breathing even and his mind clear. The moment he had long awaited, justice, not revenge, had finally arrived. Yet, even as the officers faced every consequence they deserved, he felt no triumph in their downfall. For this was never merely about 2 road cops or a single awful night, it was about a system that had long allowed men like Briggs and Mercer to operate unchecked, a system where the burden of proof was relentlessly heavier on those who looked like him. Outside, he passed rows of reporters clustered at the courthouse doors. Questions pelted him. "Judge Carter, do you have a comment? Do you believe justice was served? What do you say to those who think this was personal?" He paused, turned toward the cameras, and spoke calmly. This was never about personal revenge, it was about accountability. No one should fear those sworn to protect them, and no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. The reporters scrambled for more, but he had said all that mattered. Nathan walked down the courthouse steps as the weight of that night, 2 weeks past, finally began to lift. He wasn't naive enough to think that one hearing would transform everything, but sometimes a beginning is enough to make people listen. If we permit abuses of power to go unchecked, we become complicit in the very system that enables them. The struggle for justice isn't about retribution, it's about ensuring that no one else suffers as many already have. As Nathan slid into his car and adjusted the rearview mirror before pulling away from the courthouse, he knew that somewhere, out there, another black man might be pulled over tonight. But maybe, just maybe, tonight could be different.